He didn't just throw water. He threw away $500 million in front of the people who were about to give it to him. The glass hadn't even hit the table before the room changed. A thin arc of water cut through the warm amber light, catching reflections from crystal chandeliers and polished silverware, then landed across Naomi Brooks's face like a line drawn in silence. For a second no one moved. Forks hovered midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the soft jazz in the background seemed to hesitate, like it too was waiting to see what would happen next. Naomi didn't flinch. Not outwardly. A single drop slid from her cheek, tracing the edge of her jaw before falling to the white marble floor with a sound far louder than it should have been. Across from her, Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, calm, composed, the kind of man who believed every room already belonged to him the moment he walked in. At 39, Ethan was the definition of control, tailored navy suit, perfect posture, a voice that could move markets with a sentence. He had built Caldwell Dynamics into a 9-figure empire in under a decade, and tonight was supposed to be the night it crossed into something bigger. A $500 million investment. A room full of decision-makers. A future already signed in his mind. And Naomi? She was invisible to him. Just another server in a pressed black uniform, moving quietly between power and privilege, refilling glasses no one thanked her for. But invisibility has a strange kind of power. Because when no one sees you, you see everything. Naomi had noticed the way Ethan snapped his fingers instead of making eye contact. The way he said sweetheart like it was a shortcut to respect. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes when he spoke to anyone who couldn't offer him something in return. She had seen it all. And she had said nothing. Because people like Naomi learned early that silence could be armor. That dignity didn't need permission. That sometimes the strongest response was none at all. Next time, Ethan said, his voice low but sharp enough to carry across the table, try not to embarrass yourself. A few uncomfortable chuckles flickered and died just as quickly. Naomi reached for a linen napkin, her movements steady, precise, as if this moment had already passed for her, as if it didn't define her. But something else shifted. Not in her. In the room. A glance exchanged between two investors. A subtle tightening of a jaw. A woman at the far end of the table slowly set her glass down, her eyes no longer on her plate, but on Ethan. Because power, real power, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it watches. And sometimes it decides. And in that moment, without a single raised voice, without a single dramatic gesture, the balance in the room began to tilt. Not toward the man who thought he owned it, but away from him. The woman at the end of the table did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply stood. The soft scrape of her chair against the marble floor echoed louder than any argument could have, drawing every eye in the room without effort. Her name was Victoria Hale, a partner at one of the most respected investment firms in the country, the kind of name that appeared in financial headlines and closed deals with a single signature. She adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, calm, precise, then looked directly at Ethan Caldwell for the first time that evening, really looked at him. Not as a founder, not as a rising force, but as a man who had just revealed something far more valuable than any pitch deck ever could. I think we are done here, she said, her tone even almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder. A silence followed, but it was no longer the fragile kind from before. This one had weight. This one had direction. Ethan blinked just once, a small crack in an otherwise perfect facade. Excuse me, he replied. A faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, as if this were a misunderstanding he could easily correct. Because that was how his world worked. Problems were managed. People were persuaded. Outcomes were controlled. But Victoria did not sit back down. And more importantly, neither did anyone else. To her left, a man in his 50s, silver hair, cufflinks catching the light, slowly pushed his chair back. Then another. And another. One by one, like a quiet chain reaction, the investors began to rise, not in chaos, not in protest, but in something far more unsettling. Certainty. No one argued. No one explained. They simply gathered their things, straightened their jackets, and stepped away from the table as if an unspoken agreement had just been signed. Ethan's smile tightened, his eyes scanning the room, searching for the familiar rhythm of control, for someone to laugh it off, to break the tension, to remind everyone who he was. Let us not overreact, he said, his voice still smooth, still practiced, but now carrying a note of urgency he could not quite hide. It was a minor incident. Minor. The word hung in the air, fragile and misplaced. Across the room, Naomi had already stepped back into motion, placing the empty glass onto a tray with the same steady hands, the same quiet precision. She did not look at Ethan. She did not look at the investors. She simply continued as if her role had not changed, as if the room had not just shifted around her. But the room had changed. Because now, people were looking at her. Not through her. At her. And what they saw was not weakness, not embarrassment but composure. The kind that could not be taught in boardrooms or bought with equity. Victoria paused near the exit, glancing once more toward Ethan, then toward Naomi, and in that brief moment, something passed between them. Recognition. Not of status but of value. Character is not a minor detail, Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly. It is the whole story. And with that she turned and walked out, the glass doors closing behind her with a soft, final click that echoed far louder than the water ever had. Ethan remained where he was, standing at the head of a table that no longer belonged to him, surrounded by empty chairs and the fading illusion of control. For the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell did not speak immediately. The room did not wait for him anymore. The low hum of conversation that once orbited his presence was gone, replaced by the distant sound of elevator doors opening and closing as the last of the investors disappeared into the night. The chandeliers still glowed. The wine still breathed in crystal glasses. But the energy, the thing he had built his entire identity around, had vanished without asking for permission. Ethan slowly straightened his jacket, fingers brushing against fabric that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Control was not something he lost. Not in meetings. Not in negotiations. Not ever. And yet here he stood, at the center of a table that now felt far too large, with nothing but empty chairs and the faint echo of a sentence he could not shake. Character is the whole story. He exhaled, sharp and quiet, then reached for the back of his chair as if grounding himself in something familiar. Get them back, he said under his breath, though there was no one left to hear it. No assistant rushing in. No team waiting for instructions. Just silence. Across the room, Naomi Brooks moved toward the service station, placing her tray down with the same careful precision she had carried all night. Her reflection caught briefly in the mirrored panel behind the bar. Water had dried along the edge of her collar, leaving faint marks against the black fabric. She reached for a clean cloth, dabbing once, not hurried, not flustered, just deliberate. Because moments like this did not define her. They revealed others. A young server beside her leaned in slightly, whispering, "Are you okay?" The question was soft, uncertain, like it was not sure it had the right to exist. Naomi offered a small nod. "I am fine," she said, her voice steady, grounded in something deeper than reassurance. And she meant it. Because she had learned long ago that dignity was not something someone else could take from you. Not with a word. Not with a gesture. Not even with a room full of people watching. Behind her, footsteps approached, slower this time, measured. Ethan stopped a few feet away, not close enough to command, not far enough to ignore. For a moment he said nothing. And in that pause, something unfamiliar settled in. Not anger. Not frustration. Something quieter. Awareness. He cleared his throat lightly, the sound almost out of place. "You should have been more careful," he said finally, the words automatic, reaching for a version of himself that no longer quite fit the moment. Naomi turned then, meeting his gaze fully for the first time that night. No fear. No defiance. Just clarity. "I was," she replied. 2 words. Simple. Complete. And somehow they carried more weight than every sentence he had spoken all evening. Ethan held her gaze a second longer than he intended, then looked away first, his eyes drifting toward the empty doorway where opportunity had just walked out. Because for the first time in a very long time, he was not the most important person in the room. And he knew it. The doors had already closed, but the weight of their exit lingered like a quiet verdict no one could overturn. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his reflection faintly visible in the polished glass wall across the room. A man who looked exactly the same as he had an hour ago, and yet felt entirely unfamiliar to himself. He adjusted his cufflinks again, slower this time, as if precision alone could restore what had just slipped beyond his reach. It did not. Because control, the kind he had mastered, depended on something fragile. Perception. And tonight, perception had shifted in a way no contract could fix. "Mr. Caldwell," a voice called gently from behind. It was Daniel Reeves, one of the junior partners who had not yet made it to the exit. Younger, eager, the kind of man who studied power the way others studied maps. He hesitated before stepping closer, careful with his words, careful with his tone. "They are not coming back," he said, not as a challenge, not as a warning, but as a simple observation. Ethan did not turn immediately. He already knew. "It was one moment," Ethan replied, his voice quieter now, less certain. "One mistake does not define an entire company." Daniel considered that, his expression thoughtful, then shook his head slightly. "It does when it reveals the person leading it." The words were not sharp, but they did not need to be. Truth rarely raises its voice. Ethan finally turned, meeting Daniel's gaze, searching for disagreement, for hesitation, for anything he could use to rebuild the narrative in his favor. But there was none. Only clarity. And that was new. Across the room, Naomi had returned to clearing the table, lifting untouched plates, aligning silverware, restoring order in a space that had lost more than just a deal. Her movements were steady, almost rhythmic, like she had done this 1,000 times before, like disruption was just another part of the shift. Because for her it often was. A manager approached, his face tight with concern, glancing between her and Ethan as if trying to calculate the safest version of reality. "Naomi," he began, lowering his voice, "you can take a break if you need to." She paused just briefly, then offered a small shake of her head. "I would rather finish what I started," she said. Not defiant. Not emotional. Just resolved. The manager nodded, unsure what to say next, then stepped back, leaving her to it. "Finish what I started." The words hung in the air longer than expected, reaching further than intended. Because they were not just about clearing a table. They were about something else entirely. Something Ethan was only beginning to understand. He watched her for a moment, really watched her, not as part of the background, not as a role, but as a person who had just stood in the center of his worst decision and remained unchanged by it. And that unsettled him more than the empty chairs ever could. "You are not angry," he said suddenly, the question slipping out before he could measure it. Naomi placed a plate onto her tray, aligning it with quiet precision, then looked up again. "Anger does not fix anything," she replied. Another simple answer. Another complete truth. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something inside begins to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Because for the first time he was not trying to win the room. He was trying to understand it. And for the first time he realized he had been reading it wrong all along. The room had been reset, at least on the surface. New guests had not yet arrived, but the staff moved as if they would, as if the night still had something left to prove. Plates were replaced, glasses polished, chairs realigned with quiet efficiency. Order carefully reconstructed. But beneath that polished calm, something invisible had shifted, and it did not reset so easily. Ethan stood near the edge of the table now, no longer at its head. His position changed not by distance but by meaning. He checked his phone out of habit, expecting notifications, messages, something to anchor him back into the world he understood. There was nothing. No follow-up texts. No reassurance. Just a blank screen reflecting his own expression back at him, sharper than he remembered, but less certain. He slipped the phone back into his pocket slowly, as if even that small motion required thought now. Across the room, Naomi finished clearing the last of the untouched settings, stacking plates with steady hands, her movements unbroken, her pace unchanged. There was no rush in her. No lingering hesitation. Just completion. Because she understood something Ethan was only beginning to face. The moment had already passed. What mattered now was what remained after it. "Why did you stay calm?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without demanding attention. It was not a challenge this time. It was a question. Real, unguarded. Naomi paused, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the tray, considering not the question, but the man asking it. Then she answered, simple as before. Because I have been here before. Ethan frowned slightly, not in disagreement but in confusion. Here, he repeated, glancing around the pristine dining room, the controlled elegance, the expensive quiet. Naomi gave a small, almost invisible nod. Not this place, she said. This moment. The words settled in slowly, like something that needed time to be understood. Ethan studied her, trying to place it, trying to map her calm to an experience he could quantify, something he could measure, analyze, explain. But there was no data for this. No projection. No model. Just reality. And it does not bother you? He asked. Naomi lifted the tray, balancing its weight with ease. It used to, she said. Until I realized something. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting his again, steady, unshaken. People show you who they are when they think it does not matter. The sentence was quiet, but it landed with the weight of everything that had just happened. Ethan did not respond immediately. He could not. Because for the first time he was not evaluating someone else. He was being evaluated by something far more difficult to influence. Truth. He looked away, his gaze drifting across the empty chairs, replaying the night not as a sequence of events, but as a series of choices. Small ones. Quick ones. The kind he never thought twice about. And suddenly they did not look so small anymore. Near the entrance, the manager spoke softly with another staff member, casting occasional glances toward Ethan, unsure whether to approach or to leave him in the quiet he seemed to have earned. But no one interrupted. Because some realizations do not need witnesses. They happen in the space between what you thought you were and what you finally see. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the room's stillness. I misread the room, he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi adjusted her grip on the tray, already turning back toward the service station. No, she replied gently. You just did not think it was reading you too. And with that she walked away, leaving him standing in a room that had not changed at all, and yet felt completely different. By the time the next guests began to arrive, the room had learned how to pretend again. Soft laughter returned in fragments, glasses clinked with practiced ease, and the golden light resumed its quiet performance across polished surfaces. To anyone walking in, it would have looked like nothing had happened. That was the nature of places like this. They absorbed disruption, smoothed it over, and continued as if the truth had never interrupted the script. But Ethan Caldwell knew better now. He had not moved far, yet everything about where he stood felt different, like the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. He watched as a new group of investors settled into a nearby table, their voices low, their posture relaxed, their attention already scanning the room in ways he had once mastered. He recognized that look. The quiet evaluation. The subtle weighing of presence, behavior, signals that never made it into official reports but determined everything. And for the first time he wondered what they saw when they looked at him. Not the company. Not the numbers. Him. Across the room Naomi continued her work, greeting the new guests with the same calm tone, the same steady presence, as if the earlier moment had never touched her. But it had. Not in the way Ethan expected. It had not shaken her. It had confirmed something she already knew. That respect given is never as powerful as respect revealed. A guest asked for sparkling water. Another requested a menu adjustment. Naomi handled each interaction with quiet precision, her voice even, her posture composed, her attention complete. No hesitación. No recedo. Just professionalism anchored in something deeper than performance. Ethan noticed the difference now. Not just in her but in himself. He used to believe confidence was volume, that authority was something you projected outward, something others responded to because you expected them to. But what he had seen tonight did not fit that model. Naomi had not raised her voice. She had not defended herself. She had not demanded anything. And yet somehow she had held more power in that moment than he had with everything he brought into the room. That realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as he replayed the night again, not from his perspective but from the room's. The glances, the silence, the decision that had formed without words. It had not been about the water. It had been about what it revealed. A reflection he had not expected to see. Mr. Caldwell, the manager approached again, more cautious this time, his tone respectful but measured. Would you like to move to a private table? It was a simple offer, one that carried an unspoken understanding. A chance to step away, to regain composure, to reposition. Ethan looked at him, then at the room, then back at Naomi, who was now setting down a glass with careful precision for a guest who thanked her without hesitation. A small moment. Easy to miss. But not anymore. No, Ethan said quietly. I think I should stay. The manager nodded, unsure if that was the right answer, then stepped back. Ethan remained where he was, no longer trying to reclaim the center, no longer trying to control the narrative. Just observing. Learning something he had overlooked for years. Because the room had not rejected him for a mistake. It had responded to a truth. And truth once seen does not disappear just because the lights are still on. Nearby, Naomi turned slightly, catching his presence again, not lingering, not questioning, just acknowledging it with a brief glance before returning to her work. No judgment. No approval. Just recognition. And somehow that felt heavier than anything he had faced before. Because for the first time, Ethan Caldwell was not thinking about how to win the room. He was thinking about how to deserve it. The night did not end when the moment passed. It stretched quietly, deliberately, like a test no one had announced but everyone felt. Conversations resumed, but they carried a different tone now, softer, more measured, as if the room itself had learned something it could not unlearn. Ethan remained where he was, no longer trying to reclaim attention, no longer reaching for control that had already slipped beyond him. Instead he watched. Not casually. Intentionally. Because for the first time he realized he had spent years looking at rooms without ever truly seeing them. Across the floor, Naomi moved between tables with the same steady rhythm, her presence calm, grounded, untouched by the shifting currents around her. A guest smiled as she placed a glass down. Another thanked her by name after reading her tag. A small detail that had been ignored earlier in the night. And each time Naomi responded the same way. Not surprised. Not elevated. Just consistent. Because for her, dignity was not something that appeared in big moments. It was something she carried into every small one. Ethan noticed that now. The way she made eye contact. The way she listened fully before responding. The way she never rushed, even when the room expected her to move faster. It was not performance. It was presence. And presence, he was beginning to understand, could not be forced. It had to be earned. Near the center of the room, Daniel Reeves returned, not with urgency this time, but with something quieter. Reflection. He stood beside Ethan, following his gaze for a moment before speaking. They are still talking about it, he said, nodding subtly toward a group of new guests who had clearly heard something, their expressions curious, their attention drifting. Ethan did not react immediately. Of course they are, he replied, his voice even, stripped of the confidence that once filled it so easily. Moments like that travel faster than numbers. Daniel studied him for a second, noticing the shift, the absence of defense, the space where certainty used to live. You built something strong, Daniel said carefully. But tonight showed them something stronger. Ethan let that settle, not resisting it, not reshaping it, just allowing it to exist. Because for the first time he was not trying to win the interpretation. He was listening to it. Across the room, Naomi approached a table where a child sat quietly beside his mother, fidgeting slightly, unsure in a space designed for adults. She knelt just enough to meet him at eye level, her voice soft, her tone warm, asking if he would like a different drink, something simpler, something he would enjoy. The child nodded, relieved, and the mother offered a grateful smile. It was a small moment, easy to overlook. But Ethan did not miss it. Because that was the difference. He had spent years commanding rooms. Naomi was connecting with them. And connection, he realized, was something no title could replace. Do you think it can be fixed? Ethan asked quietly, not looking at Daniel, not looking at anyone in particular, just speaking into the space that now felt more honest than anything he had stood in before. Daniel did not answer immediately. He watched Naomi for a second, then looked back at Ethan. That depends, he said, on whether you are trying to fix the deal or yourself. The question lingered unanswered but not ignored. Ethan nodded slowly, not because he had an answer, but because he finally understood the question. And for the first time that night, that felt like a beginning. The question did not leave the room. It settled into it, quiet but persistent, shaping the space in ways no one could quite name. Ethan stood there, feeling it not as pressure but as clarity. The kind that does not demand action but waits for it. Across the room, Naomi finished serving the table with the child, offering a small nod to the mother before stepping back into motion, her pace unchanged, her presence steady. She was not performing recovery. She was simply continuing. And somehow, that carried more weight than any apology Ethan had considered forming in his mind, because he had been thinking about it. The words, the tone, the timing, all the elements he had mastered in boardrooms where every sentence was calculated, every pause intentional. But this was different. This was not a negotiation. This was not a strategy. This was something far less comfortable. It required honesty without leverage. He took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between himself and the service station where Naomi now stood, organizing clean glasses with the same precise rhythm. He stopped a few feet away, not too close, not imposing, just present. For a moment he said nothing. And that silence, unlike before, was not empty. It was deliberate. Naomi sensed him before she looked up, her hands pausing briefly against the rim of a glass before settling. She met his gaze again, calm as always, not expecting anything, not asking for anything. Just present. Ethan inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried decision with it. "I was wrong," he said. "No explanation. No justification." Just 4 words placed carefully without decoration. Naomi held his gaze, studying not the words but the space behind them. Because words were easy. Meaning was not. The room did not react. No one turned. No one interrupted. It was a moment that existed outside of performance, outside of audience. Just 2 people, standing in the aftermath of something that could not be undone, only understood. "Yes," she replied gently. Not harsh. Not forgiving. Just true. Ethan nodded once, accepting it, not resisting it, not trying to soften it into something easier to carry. Because this was not about comfort. It was about recognition. He glanced briefly at the tables, the guests, the quiet rhythm of a night that had moved on without him, then back at Naomi. "I thought respect came with position," he said, more to himself than to her. "I was wrong about that too." Naomi picked up another glass, aligning it with the others, her movements unchanged, her focus steady. "Respect shows up when people do," she said. "Not when titles do." Another simple sentence. Another truth he had never needed to consider before. Ethan let out a slow breath. Not heavy, not dramatic, just real. "I do not know how to fix what happened," he admitted. Naomi looked at him again, not with expectation, not with instruction, just with clarity. "You do not fix it," she said. "You learn from it." The distinction settled deeper than anything else that night. Because fixing was temporary. Learning was permanent. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, absorbing it, not as a lesson delivered, but as one earned. Then he nodded, once quiet, resolved, and stepped back, not to retreat, but to give space, something he had never thought to offer before. And as he turned not to reclaim the room, but to walk through it differently, the shift was no longer just something he felt. It was something he had chosen. The night did not end with applause or closure. It ended the way truth often does, quietly, without announcement, leaving behind something far more lasting than noise. The room continued to move, guests finishing their meals, conversations weaving in and out, but for Ethan Caldwell, everything felt sharper now, more defined, as if the world had adjusted its focus without asking him. He walked past the tables not as the man who owned the space, but as someone moving through it for the first time, aware of every glance, every interaction, every small exchange he had once ignored. A server passed by carrying a tray, and this time Ethan stepped slightly aside, a small gesture, almost invisible but intentional. The server nodded in acknowledgement, a brief moment of mutual recognition that would have meant nothing to him just hours ago. Now it stayed with him. Because power, he realized, was not in being seen. It was in how you chose to see others. Near the entrance, the glass doors reflected the city lights outside. A skyline built on ambition, on deals, on men who believed control was the same as respect. Ethan paused there, his reflection staring back at him, familiar and unfamiliar at once. He had walked into this night expecting expansion, expecting validation, expecting the next level of success to confirm everything he believed about himself. Instead, he was leaving with something far less comfortable: perspective. And strangely, it felt more valuable than anything he had lost. Behind him, Naomi continued her shift, moving through the room with the same steady rhythm, untouched by titles, unchanged by attention, grounded in something no one had given her and no one could take away. A guest thanked her again, this time with genuine warmth, and she responded with the same calm nod, the same quiet grace. Nothing about her had shifted. And that was the point. The night had not elevated her. It had revealed her. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze finding her one last time across the room. There was no dramatic moment, no final exchange, just a brief meeting of eyes, a silent acknowledgement of something that did not need to be spoken again. He nodded once, subtle, respectful, then pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The city moved as it always did, cars passing, lights flickering, people walking with purpose, unaware of the small shift that had just taken place inside one room among thousands. But that was how change worked. It did not announce itself. It did not wait for permission. It happened in moments like this, when someone who thought they understood power finally learned what it meant. Ethan took a breath, deeper than the ones he had taken inside, and for the first time in years, it did not feel like preparation for the next move. Felt like space. And somewhere behind him, inside that room, the lesson remained. Not in the deal that was lost, not in the people who walked away, but in the quiet truth that stayed behind. That power can fill a room, but character decides who is worth staying in it.